Before I tell you what happened, let me just say this. If you've ever trusted someone only to find out they were quietly working against you, you're not alone. And if you want to hear more real stories like mine, the kind that make you think twice about who's in your corner, you should subscribe right now so you don't miss any of them. My name's Richard. A few months ago, I buried my wife, Emily. 42 years of marriage gone in a single quiet afternoon. The days after the funeral were a blur. Condolences, casseroles, endless paperwork. I was trying to survive the grief one step at a time. And then my son David started stopping by more often. At first, I thought it was to check on me. I didn't realize until later that he was actually checking on my assets, the house, the accounts, the life Emily and I built together. What he didn't know, what even I had almost forgotten, was that Emily had left me something else, something I never told him about. And in the end, that secret would be the one thing that saved me. I never thought I'd outlive her, not my Emily. She was the kind of person who seemed to make life itself bloom wherever she walked. She had a laugh that made people pause just to listen, as if the sound alone could warm their day. We'd been married for 42 years, and though we'd had our share of arguments, there was never a single moment I doubted her love. The day of the funeral was cold, though the weather report had promised early spring warmth. The sky hung low thick with gray clouds that looked ready to burst, but never did. The air was damp, and every breath I took carried a sting. I sat in the front row of the church, staring at the polished wood of her casket, unable to take in the fact that she was inside. Just days before she'd been sitting across from me at our kitchen table teasing me for the way I always buttered my toast to the very edge. Now she was gone. People moved around me like shadows, friends, neighbors, old co-workers. Their voices were muffled as though they were coming from underwater. A steady stream of hands patted my shoulder, each offering their condolences, but I couldn't hold on to the words. It was all a blur, a haze of floral perfume, rustling coats, and the faint smell of lilies that filled the church, until it was almost choking. My son David was there too, of course. He stood near the back, during most of the service, talking quietly with someone I didn't recognize. When he came to sit beside me, his hand brushed mine, but it was a light touch, more an obligation than comfort. I told myself not to take it personally. He'd lost his mother after all. We were both adrift in the same cold current. After the burial, we went back to my house, Emily's house, our house. The place smelled faintly of the apple pie she'd baked the week before she passed, as if her presence still lingered in the air. I lowered myself into my chair in the living room, exhausted in a way that went beyond my bones. David walked in a few minutes later, still on his phone, tapping away at whatever seemed more pressing than the room we were in. "You should think about your living situation now, Dad," he said suddenly without looking up from his screen. It caught me off guard. My living situation? He nodded absently. "Yeah. It's a lot to keep up with. This house, the yard, all the bills. Maybe you should consider something smaller, something more manageable. Maybe one of those senior communities. You'd have company there, meals, medical care." I tuned him out after that. The words felt like cold water splashing across my face. My wife's funeral wasn't even 24 hours past, and my son was already talking about where to put me. I told myself I was imagining the urgency in his tone, but deep down I felt the first crack forming. Something wasn't right. The days that followed were a strange mixture of numbness and noise. I kept busy with the endless list of tasks that follow death paperwork, death certificates, bank calls, insurance forms. People don't tell you how much business there is in dying. I went through it mechanically, like a man walking a road. He didn't choose one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. David started visiting more often. At first, I thought it was concern, but soon I noticed he rarely stayed for more than half an hour, and most of that time was spent asking me questions. Did I have a will? Where was it? Had I contacted the bank yet? Did Mom have any investments he should know about? I brushed off the unease that rose in my chest each time, telling myself he was just trying to help. One afternoon, I caught him in Emily's study. She'd kept it immaculate the way she did everything. Her desk was still lined with neat stacks of stationery, her favorite fountain pen resting in its holder. David was bent over the filing cabinet, flipping through folders. "What are you looking for?" I asked. He straightened quickly, too quickly. "Just Mom's medical records. I thought we might need them for some paperwork." I nodded slowly, pretending to believe him. but I knew Emily's medical files were in the hall closet, not in her desk. That night, after he'd left, I sat in my recliner and let the house wrap around me in silence. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper from the past. Emily had been meticulous about everything, especially our finances. She'd often joked that she was the CFO of our marriage. I'd always laughed at that, letting her handle the big decisions. Maybe I'd been too trusting. The next morning, as I drank my coffee, my eyes landed on the small safe tucked behind the bookshelf. It had been years since I'd opened it. Emily had the combination memorized, but she'd told me it was also written down in a sealed envelope in her desk. I fetched it, turned the dial, and opened the heavy door. Inside were the usual documents, birth certificates, our marriage license, insurance policies. And then, buried beneath an old photo album, was something I hadn't thought about in years, a manila folder labeled Lake House. The sight of it sent a flicker of recognition through me. The Lake House. Emily had bought it more than a decade ago, a quiet little place by the water, saying it was for later. We'd never told David about it. Not because we were hiding it, just because it had never come up. And in the chaos of her illness, I'd forgotten it even existed. I ran my fingers over the folder, feeling a strange pull in my chest. At the time, it didn't seem like more than a bittersweet memory. But looking back now, I realized that was the moment the seed of everything that came after was planted. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with that manila folder in front of me. The steam from my coffee drifted upward, curling into the still air, while my fingers rested on the edge of the paper, as if it might vanish if I moved too quickly. I couldn't believe I'd let it slip from my memory for so long. The lake house wasn't just a purchase. It had been one of Emily's little dreams. She'd found it during a weekend drive years ago, a white clapboard cottage with peeling paint, set back from the water, under a canopy of old pines. It wasn't much to look at then, but she'd seen what it could be. She convinced me to buy it with the money from a small inheritance she'd received, saying it would be our escape hatch when the world got too loud. We went there a few times over the years, fixing it up in little bursts, but life always pulled us back to the main house. I opened the folder and found the deed utility records and a handful of photographs. Emily standing on the small wooden porch, a mug of tea in her hand, her hair pulled back with that faded blue scarf she loved. Looking at those pictures, I could almost hear the loons calling across the water and feel the sun dipping behind the tree line. It was ours free and clear, tucked away in a quiet corner of the state. And David didn't know a thing about it. It struck me then how dangerous that ignorance could be for him, but more importantly, for me. If he ever found out, the lake house would be the first thing he'd set his sights on. He'd been asking more and more questions about our finances lately, and not in the way a concerned son might. It was sharper than that, like a man taking inventory of his inheritance. 2 days later, David came by again. I could hear his car in the driveway before the doorbell rang. He walked in with that false cheerfulness people use when they've already decided what's best for you. "Hey, Dad," he said, glancing around the living room as if mentally assessing how much work it would take to empty it. "Thought I'd drop by and see how you're holding up." I made small talk, letting him talk more than I did. It didn't take long before he steered the conversation to the big house and how much upkeep it must be. I watched him over the rim of my coffee cup, the same way you might watch a raccoon sniffing around your garbage cans. Later that night, after he left, I decided I needed to check on the lake house in person. It had been over a year since I'd been there. I packed a small bag, locked the manila folder in my briefcase, and left early the next morning. The drive was quiet, the kind of quiet you can only find on back roads. The closer I got, the more I remembered why Emily had loved it so much. When I pulled up, the place was just as we'd left it, modest but solid, with a small dock stretching into the still water. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Inside, the furniture was covered in sheets, the air slightly stale, but everything was intact. I stood in the living room and looked out at the lake through the big front window. The water was like glass reflecting the morning sky. I could almost hear Emily's voice telling me this was where we'd sit in our old age, where we'd watch the seasons change without anyone to bother us. It hit me then, this place could be more than a memory. It could be my refuge, my escape hatch, just like she'd said. Over the next few days, I started making small trips back and forth, moving some of my personal things, photo albums, important papers, a few tools. I didn't take anything that would leave obvious gaps at the main house. I didn't want David suspecting a thing. Every time I drove out to the lake house, I felt a little lighter, like I was putting distance between myself and something dangerous. Back at the main house, David's visits grew more frequent. He started showing up unannounced sometimes when I wasn't home. Once I came back to find the front door unlocked, though I knew I'd locked it when I left. I told myself I must have been distracted, but deep down I didn't believe it. Then one afternoon, I walked in and found him standing in the hallway with a stack of papers in his hands. He quickly shoved them back into a drawer when he saw me. "What's that?" I asked. "Just some old bills," he said too quickly. "Thought I'd help you sort through them." His eyes didn't quite meet mine. I nodded, pretending to accept it, but the unease in my chest tightened into something harder. That night, I went to the safe and double-checked the lake house folder. It was still there, but I didn't like the idea of keeping it where David could find it if he got nosy enough. The next morning, I moved it to a locked cabinet at the lake house. I started sleeping better there, even if I still spent most nights at the main house. The lake was quiet, the air clean, and there was a peace in knowing I had a place David couldn't touch. He might have been circling like a vulture over the main house, but here I was, untouchable. Still, I knew peace wouldn't last forever. David was getting bolder, and I had the sinking feeling that whatever he was planning, he was getting close to making his move. For now, I kept my cards close to my chest. I smiled when he talked about retirement homes. I let him think I was indecisive. I played the part of the grieving, aging father who didn't have the energy to argue. Inside, though, a plan was starting to form. I didn't know all the pieces yet, but I knew one thing when the time came: the lake house would be my way out. It was a Tuesday when I noticed it. The sun was streaming through the kitchen window, glinting off the stainless steel kettle when my eyes fell on Emily's desk in the corner of the room. The bottom drawer was pulled out halfway, a stack of papers sitting unevenly inside. Emily had been meticulous with her desk. Every pen, paperclip, and envelope had its place. Even after she passed, I'd kept it that way, almost as a small shrine to her orderliness. But now, something was off. I went over and slid the drawer open. The first thing I noticed was that the folder containing our home's insurance documents was at the top when it should have been filed alphabetically near the back. Beneath it, bank statements and old tax returns were shuffled in a way that screamed of rushed hands. David. I didn't need proof to know it was him. He'd been coming by more often, staying just long enough to check on me before disappearing into other parts of the house. I'd already caught him in Emily's study once. Now it seemed his curiosity or greed was growing. The next day, as I walked to the mailbox, my neighbor Mrs. Landry waved me over. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything but rarely shared unless prompted. That day, she didn't need prompting. "Your son was here yesterday while you were out," she said, lowering her voice like she was delivering classified information. "He was talking to that real estate agent, you know, the one with the blonde hair who drives the black SUV. They stood in your driveway for a good 20 minutes. My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. "Did you hear what they were talking about?" She shook her head. "No, but it didn't look like small talk." I thanked her, forcing a calm smile, and walked back to the house. Inside, I sat down and thought about what she'd just told me. There was no reason for David to be talking to a realtor unless he had intentions for this house. And given his sudden interest in my living situation, I could only guess what those intentions were. That night, I drove to the lake house. The drive felt longer than usual, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, I went straight to the small cabinet where I'd stashed the deed and related papers. They were still there, safe and untouched. I exhaled, feeling that small relief you get when you find something exactly where you left it. But I knew this was no longer just about keeping the lake house a secret. It was about protecting it. Over the next week, I started moving more than just paperwork. I brought over a set of clothes, non-perishable food, a spare phone charger, and a few essential tools. I stocked the pantry with canned goods and bottled water. If I needed to disappear from the main house quickly, I wanted the lake house to be livable immediately. One morning, while sorting through the drawers in my own desk at the main house, I found a document that made my stomach tighten, a blank property transfer form. It wasn't mine, and I hadn't printed it. My printer had been out of ink for weeks. That meant David had either brought it with him or printed it here using his own paper. Either way, it was a sign of intent. I slipped the paper into a folder marked Taxes 2016 and put it back in the drawer. I wanted it there in case I ever needed to show someone. Proof. The following Sunday, David stopped by again. He carried a manila envelope under his arm and that same false smile on his face. "Got a minute?" he asked, not waiting for me to answer before stepping inside. He set the envelope on the table and started talking about the benefits of downsizing. I listened, nodding occasionally, my mind elsewhere. The envelope was just sitting there, inches from my hand. When he went to the kitchen for a glass of water, I slid it open just enough to see inside. There were papers, some kind of valuation report for my house. That was it. There was no pretending anymore. He wasn't just thinking about my future comfort. He was making plans to cash in on this house. That night, I took a walk around the lake house property. The moon was out spilling silver across the water. The dock creaked softly under my weight as I stood at the edge, hands in my pockets. Emily's voice came back to me in fragments, her excitement when she'd found this place, her vision for what it could be, the way she'd called it, our safe place. Safe. That was when I decided to do more than just hide the paperwork. I started moving my most important possessions there, things I couldn't replace. Emily's wedding ring, my Navy service medals, the few family photographs that meant something to me. I wrapped them carefully and stored them in a locked chest in the lake house bedroom closet. At the main house, I left everything looking untouched. If David came snooping again, I wanted him to think he had access to everything. I wanted him to feel in control, to believe I was drifting toward the decision he wanted me to make. Inside, though, I was setting the stage for something else entirely. I began to watch him more closely, noting his tells. The way his knee bounced when he was impatient, how he cleared his throat before bringing up money, the slight uptick in his voice when he was trying to sound casual but was actually fishing for information. I made mental notes of each visit. I even started writing them down in a small notebook I kept in my nightstand at the lake house. Dates, times, what he said, what he touched in the house, who he was with. If this ever came to a fight, I'd have my own ledger to work from. But I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. Confrontation would only push him to act faster, and I needed time to prepare, time to ensure that when the moment came, I'd be the one holding the final card. For now, I'd let him think he was getting closer to his goal. Let him circle the prey. I'd be ready when he struck. By early summer, David's visits had shifted in tone. He no longer tiptoed around the subject of my living arrangements. Now, every conversation seemed to circle back to it, like a vulture returning to a carcass. It started small, offhand remarks about how big the house felt without Mom or how quiet it must be for me alone. Then it grew bolder. One afternoon, he showed up with a glossy brochure for a retirement community 2 towns over. "They've got everything," Daddy said, laying it on the table like a winning poker hand. Private rooms, 3 meals a day, group activities. You wouldn't have to worry about mowing the lawn or shoveling snow ever again. I picked up the brochure, flipping through the pages of smiling seniors playing bingo couples holding hands in manicured gardens. It looked fine. It also looked like a cage. I smiled faintly, setting it back down. "I'll think about it." That answer seemed to satisfy him, but I could see the spark in his eyes, the kind that comes when someone believes they're wearing you down. A week later, he brought another brochure. This time, the price was highlighted in yellow. "It's affordable too, especially if you sell this place," he said, his voice just a touch too casual. It wasn't casual, it was calculated. Every move he made was aimed at getting me out of this house and the deed into his reach. One Thursday, I came home from the grocery store and found him standing in the living room with a man I didn't recognize. The stranger wore a blazer despite the heat and carried a leather portfolio. "This is Mr. Jensen," David said quickly. "He's a realtor friend of mine, just stopping by to get his opinion on the place." I stared at them both, my keys still in my hand. Opinion for what? David didn't flinch. "Just, in case you decide to sell. No harm in knowing what it's worth." I set my grocery bag down on the couch. "Well, I'm not selling." Mr. Jensen gave me a polite nod, murmured something about having another appointment, and left. David lingered, clearly annoyed that his little surprise tour had been cut short. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the lights low, thinking about the day. This was no longer speculation, he was making moves. And if I didn't play this right, he'd push me into a corner before I was ready. The next day, I drove to the lake house. The air was cooler by the water, the kind of crispness you don't find in town. I walked the perimeter, checking locks, making sure my hidden chest in the closet was still secure. I decided it was time to do more than just store valuables here. It was time to prepare for a full move, even if only temporary. I called a local handyman to fix a loose shutter and patch a small leak in the roof. Paid in cash. No paper trail. I brought in new locks for the doors and installed them myself. If David ever found this place, I didn't want him strolling in with a spare key from somewhere. Back at the main house, I made a conscious effort to play along with his suggestions. I asked questions about these retirement homes, feigning uncertainty. I acted tired more often, even rubbing my temples when he talked about the hassle of upkeep. I let him think I was drifting toward his plan. The truth was, every moment of agreement bought me more time to shift important things out of his reach. I started packing small boxes labeled with vague terms like old clothes or kitchen extras and taking them to the lake house under the guise of donating them. One afternoon, as I was returning from the lake house, I parked down the street from my main house and watched from inside my car. Sure enough, David's SUV was in the driveway. He had the garage door open and was standing inside looking through shelves. He didn't see me. I stayed there for nearly 20 minutes before he finally left, locking the garage behind him. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Confrontation would make him rush, and rushing would mean I might miss something in my preparation. Instead, I doubled down. I started scanning important family photos and documents, saving them to a small, encrypted flash drive I kept in my pocket. I arranged for a separate P.O. box near the lake house. I even opened a new checking account at a credit union in that area, moving small amounts of money over time so it wouldn't draw attention. I became a shadow in my own life, visible enough to seem normal but always moving pieces in the background. Then came the moment that confirmed everything I feared. One evening, I overheard David on the phone in the kitchen. I was in the hallway halfway up the stairs when I heard his voice drop to that low, urgent tone people use when they're closing in on something they want. Yeah, he was saying once the place is sold, I'll be able to pay off everything. It's just a matter of getting him to sign. He paused, listening. No, he doesn't know the market value. I'll handle it. I stood there, the wood of the stair rail cool under my palm, and let the words sink in. This wasn't just greed, it was desperation. And desperate people make mistakes. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the wind against the windows. My mind was no longer clouded by grief or confusion. I knew exactly what was happening. And I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't just protect myself. I'd make sure David understood the cost of trying to take what wasn't his. The decision came to me one quiet morning at the lake house. I was sitting on the small porch with a mug of coffee watching the mist rise off the water when I realized I didn't have to wait for David to make his move. I could make mine first. If I disappeared from the main house without warning, if I slipped away into this quiet sanctuary, he'd have nothing to push against. No arguments to twist, no pressure points to work. I'd be gone before he even realized what happened. The trick was to do it without him suspecting a thing. I started with the essentials. My personal documents, the few valuable items left in the main house, Emily's jewelry box. All of it went into sturdy, nondescript boxes I labeled with vague terms like winter clothes or garage stuff. I transported them in the trunk of my car, always making sure I had a believable reason to be out. Next came the financial groundwork. I visited my bank on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew David was at work closing a joint account he'd been listed as a secondary on. I withdrew a modest amount in cash, enough to handle emergencies, and deposited it into my new credit union account near the lake. I also set up a mail forwarding service to a P.O. box in that same town. From now on, anything important would bypass the main house entirely. I left the main house looking exactly as it always had. Furniture in place, closets still full of clothes. I didn't care about kitchen stocked with basics. To anyone walking in, it would look lived in. That was intentional. If David came sniffing around while I was gone, I wanted him to believe I was still there, just out running errands, maybe visiting a friend. Over the next couple of weeks, I made small practice runs to the lake house. I'd spend a night or two, then come back to the main house before David had a chance to notice my absence. Each time I brought a little more with me. A set of dishes, bedding tools, canned food. Piece by piece, I was building a self-sufficient life out here, one that required nothing from the world outside. Then one Thursday morning, I decided it was time. I woke before dawn, packed the last of my important things into the car, and drove out to the lake house without leaving a note. The sun was just coming up when I pulled into the gravel driveway, the air still heavy with early morning coolness. Inside, the place smelled faintly of cedar and dust, but it felt like mine, in a way the main house hadn't for months. The relief hit me almost immediately. Out here, there were no surprise visits, no hushed phone calls, no staged realtor drop-ins, just quiet water, swaying trees, and the knowledge that I was out of reach. I didn't cut off all ties right away. I still answered David's calls, still let him believe I was at the main house. If he asked why I wasn't picking up right away, I'd say I'd been out in the yard or down the street visiting a neighbor. I gave him just enough to keep suspicion at bay. At the same time, I took the next step in my protection plan, moving the lake house into a trust. I contacted a lawyer in the next county, someone with no connections to my hometown, and explained what I wanted. The trust would be set up in a way that bypassed probate entirely, making it nearly impossible for David to touch. It was a quiet, unglamorous process, but it was the kind of invisible wall I needed between me and his schemes. During this time, I also started documenting everything more thoroughly. Every call from David, every suggestion about selling the house, every uninvited appearance, I wrote it down with dates and times. I kept the notebook in my desk at the lake house, knowing he'd never see it. The weeks slipped by, and the separation between my two lives grew sharper. In town, I was still the widower in the big house, occasionally seen picking up groceries or walking to the post office. Out here, I was something else, self-contained, alert ready. Then came the test. One Saturday afternoon, David called saying he was in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. I was at the lake house 2 hours away. I told him I was just stepping out for a bit, but to go ahead and let himself in if he wanted to wait. When I finally returned to the main house the next morning, I found little signs he'd been there. A dining chair pulled slightly out, a pen missing from the kitchen counter, the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hallway. He hadn't left a note, hadn't called again. That was confirmation enough he was still circling, still looking for an opening. But now he was circling an empty shell. Back at the lake house that evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, the sun dipping behind the pines. The water was still, except for the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface. I thought about Emily, about the life we'd built, and the way she'd always been 3 steps ahead of any problem. In a way, this was her plan as much as mine. She'd bought this place for later, but later had arrived in a way neither of us could have predicted. The main house was no longer my home, it was bait, and I was more than willing to let David keep circling it until the moment came for me to spring the trap. For now, though, I had what I needed, distant safety, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that every move he made was against a target that was already gone. The more distance I put between myself and the main house, the clearer my thinking became. Grief had dulled my instincts after Emily's death, but now the fog was gone. I could see David's pattern for what it was, a steady tightening of the noose, but I wasn't going to fight him head on. No, I'd let him keep tightening it until the moment I stepped aside and let him choke on his own rope. The key was to make him believe he was winning. Whenever he called, I sounded tired. I let my voice trail off, paused a beat too long before answering questions. If he asked how the yard work was going, I'd sigh and say, "It's getting harder every year." If he mentioned the electric bill, I'd mutter something about rising costs. Little things, nothing dramatic, but enough to feed the story I wanted him to believe that I was wearing down. Meanwhile, I doubled down on preparation. I visited the lake house more often, setting up a spare phone line under a different name. I bought a small lockbox for the local bank branch, storing scanned copies of all important documents there. In the garage, I kept a neatly packed tote with enough supplies to leave on a moment's notice, clothes, toiletries, a small amount of cash. One late afternoon, I returned to the main house to find a business card tucked under my front door. Mark Dawson Residential Real Estate in bold print. On the back, in handwriting that was definitely not the realtor's, were the words, "Call me when you're ready to sell." I didn't need to guess how he got my address or who had sent him. That evening, I called David. I kept my tone warm, almost apologetic, as if I were ashamed for holding him back. "Maybe you're right," I said. "Maybe I should start thinking seriously about downsizing. Just give me a little time to sort through things." The pause on the other end told me everything. He thought the game was almost over. The very next day, he showed up unannounced with another realtor, this one a woman named Karen, who looked at the house with a measuring gaze, already talking about potential updates and open floor plans. I smiled politely, offered coffee, and agreed to let her run some numbers. All the while, I was noting every detail, how long they were there, what rooms they lingered in, what she whispered to David when she thought I couldn't hear. A week later, I made another calculated move. I began boxing up a few items in plain sight. I stacked them neatly in the living room, just enough for him to notice when he came by. When he asked about them, I told him I was sorting things for donation. His eyes lit up, mistaking my staging for surrender. In reality, nothing in those boxes mattered. Old blankets, chipped plates, a couple of outdated jackets, decoys meant to deepen his confidence. At the same time, I started recording our conversations. I bought a small, discreet recorder that fit in my shirt pocket. Anytime we talked, whether in person or over the phone, I made sure the device was on. The law in this state allowed it as long as one party was aware, and I was more than aware. My notebook at the lake house began to fill faster. Dates, times, exact quotes, even small behavioral details. If I needed to take this to an attorney or the police, I'd have a rock-solid record. By midsummer, David was openly talking about next steps. He'd drop lines like, "Once you're settled somewhere smaller," or "when the house is on the market," as if both were already decided. He even suggested a timeline, early fall, because the market's hot right now. I agreed to nothing but let him think I was nodding along. Then, just to throw him off balance, I brought up the idea of leaving the state altogether. I said I'd been thinking about moving closer to an old Navy buddy down in Arizona. The flash of panic in his eyes was quick but unmistakable. He masked it with a smile, but I'd seen it. The thought of me taking everything, and I mean everything, out of his reach rattled him. That was good. A rattled opponent makes sloppy moves. A week later, he arrived with what he called great news. He'd found a cash buyer interested in my house. "They can close fast, Dad," he said, leaning forward like a man about to share a winning lottery ticket. "You won't have to worry about a thing." I let a small smile tug at my lips, just enough to make him think I was warming to the idea. "Let's talk about it soon," I said. "I just need to get a few affairs in order first." That night, back at the lake house, I locked the doors, sat in my recliner, and went over the timeline I'd built. Everything was in place. The trust, the hidden assets, the escape route. All that was left was to let David commit himself fully, to put enough of his cards on the table, that when I pulled mine, the blow would be absolute. I thought of Emily as I watched the moonlight stretch across the water. She had been the one to teach me patience, to remind me that some of the best victories aren't about speed, they're about timing. And this, I realized, was exactly that kind of battle. The trap wasn't just ready, it was perfect. The morning it happened was bright and deceptively calm. I was at the main house intentionally because I knew David would be making his move soon. I'd given him just enough encouragement over the past weeks to convince him the finish line was in sight. Around 10 a.m., I heard the crunch of tires on the driveway. I looked out the window and saw David's SUV pull up, followed by a sleek black sedan. Out stepped a man in an expensive suit, and Karen, the realtor from before. David climbed out of his car with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the prize is already yours. They walked up the front path together, all smiles as if this was a celebration. "Dad," David greeted me, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I wanted to introduce you to Mr. Sanderson. He's the buyer I told you about. Cash deal quick, close, no inspections to worry about." Mr. Sanderson shook my hand, a firm, businesslike grip. Karen hovered nearby with a leather folder in hand, probably holding the paperwork she thought I'd be signing today. I played my part, perfectly quiet, slightly hesitant, but not hostile. "And what exactly would this involve?" I asked, settling into my chair as they stood before me like a panel of judges. "It's simple," David said, his voice warm with fake reassurance. "We just need your signature on the agreement today, and you can have the funds in your account by the end of the month. You'll be free to move wherever you want. No more house maintenance, no more stress." I looked at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it was almost uncomfortable. Then I leaned back, slightly folded my hands, and said, "Funny thing, David, I've already moved." The expression on his face shifted instantly: confusion, then suspicion, then something sharper. "What do you mean?" I said, keeping my tone calm. "I've been living somewhere else for weeks now. Somewhere you don't know about. And as for selling this house, well, I'm not selling it. Not to you, not to anyone you bring here." Karen blinked. Mr. Sanderson frowned slightly. David's jaw tightened. "You can't just," he started, but I cut him off. "I can do exactly that," I said evenly. "And I have. In fact, I've taken steps to ensure that every property I own is protected from your reach. The lake house, for example, is in a trust now. Untouchable." The room went still. David stared at me, his eyes narrowing as the words sank in. "Lake house." He repeated the tone, almost a growl. "Yes," I said, standing slowly. "The lake house your mother and I bought years ago. The one you never knew about. The one I now call home." Karen glanced at David, clearly realizing this was not the meeting she'd been promised. Mr. Sanderson shifted uncomfortably, obviously eager to be anywhere else. "You've been snooping through my things," I continued, my voice steady but firm. "Talking to realtors, lining up buyers, trying to rush me into decisions you thought I was too weak to question. I've let you think you were succeeding because I wanted to see just how far you'd go. And now I know." David's face flushed red. "Dad, you're making a mistake." "No," I interrupted. "The mistake would have been trusting you any further." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, charged. Then, without another word, Karen closed her folder, mumbled something about rescheduling, and walked out. Mr. Sanderson followed, giving me a polite nod as he left. David lingered, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You're going to regret this," he said, finally, his voice low. I stepped closer, meeting his glare with a calm I knew would unsettle him. "No, David. You are." He left without slamming the door, which somehow felt more ominous than if he had. I watched his SUV pull out of the driveway, followed closely by the black sedan. When the sound of their engines faded, the house fell silent again. I sat down, the adrenaline still humming in my veins. It wasn't joy I felt, at least not yet. It was something quieter, but far more satisfying, the knowledge that I had just taken back control in full view of the person who'd been trying to strip it away. That night, I returned to the lake house. I locked the door behind me, set my keys on the counter, and poured myself a drink. The reflection of the moon shimmered across the water outside, and for the first time in months, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of safety. The battle wasn't over. David wouldn't give up easily, but now the game had shifted. The element of surprise was mine, and I intended to use it. After that day, David's tone changed. He didn't stop contacting me, but the energy in his voice was different. The forced cheerfulness was gone, replaced by something tighter, sharper, as though every word was part of an effort to regain control. I answered his calls when it suited me, sometimes letting them ring out, sometimes returning them hours later. When we did speak, I kept the conversation short and vague. I never mentioned the lake house, never told him where I was staying most nights. If he asked, I'd say I'm around and leave it at that. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Through a mutual acquaintance, a friend of Emily's who still had coffee with me now, and then I learned that David had taken out a personal loan earlier in the year, likely expecting to pay it off with the sale of my house. With that plan derailed, he was juggling bills. The thought didn't bring me joy exactly, but it did bring a grim satisfaction. Around this time, I began to share my side of the story, but only with select people. I told my sister, who lived 2 states away, about the pressure David had been putting on me. I mentioned it to a couple of trusted neighbors, framing it as concern rather than accusation. The result was predictable. Word began to spread. Small-town gossip is like wind. It moves fast and slips through cracks you didn't know were there. Soon, people were giving David side-eye at the grocery store, at the hardware store, even at church. No one accused him outright, but the air around him grew colder. That kind of quiet suspicion can eat at a person more than open confrontation. One afternoon, I stopped by the main house to pick up a few things and found an envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a flyer from the local paper, an awareness campaign about elder financial abuse. I hadn't spoken to the reporter, but the story inside mirrored my own situation in uncanny detail. Adult children pressuring aging parents to sell their homes, isolating them from resources, and exploiting their grief. I knew exactly how it had gotten there. Mrs. Landry, my observant neighbor, was friendly with one of the columnists. She'd clearly put in a word, and while my name wasn't in the article, I could feel its ripple effect in town. Meanwhile, my life at the lake house grew more comfortable. I planted tomatoes in the small garden Emily had once dreamed about. I took my morning coffee out on the dock, watching the water shift with the wind. Some days, I barely thought about the main house at all until David forced himself back into my awareness. He called one evening, his voice low and urgent. "Dad, I think we should talk. I might have come on too strong before, and I just want to make things right." I let him speak, listening to his carefully chosen words. He talked about family first and starting fresh, but beneath it, I could hear the scramble. He was trying to get back in my good graces, not out of love, but because the door to my assets was closing, and he knew it. "All right," I said finally. "We can meet. Coffee shop in town tomorrow at 10. When he arrived, he looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was less neat than usual. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've been thinking he began wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. We've had our differences, but you're my father. I don't want us to be at odds. I nodded slowly, letting him believe I was considering his words. That's good to hear. He leaned in slightly. Maybe we can talk about arrangements for the future. I don't need anything now, but when the time comes. I cut him off. David, I've already taken care of my will. Everything's settled. His smile faltered. Oh, what do you mean? I mean, I said, my voice steady, that the house will be sold when I pass, and the proceeds will go to the Veterans Assistance Fund. The lake house, too. You won't have to worry about a thing. The words landed like a blow. His face went pale, his mouth opening slightly as if he'd misheard. You're cutting me out. I'm protecting my assets, I corrected, from anyone who might try to take them before their time. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he leaned back, his eyes cold. You'll regret this. I met his gaze without flinching. No, David. I think I'll sleep better than I have in years. We finished our coffees in silence. When he left, he didn't look back. Over the next few weeks, I saw less and less of him. No surprise visits, no phone calls. Word in town was that he was keeping to himself, which I translated to mean he was licking his wounds. I didn't gloat, but I also didn't mourn the distance. The revenge wasn't a single explosive act, it was a slow burn, the steady dismantling of his leverage until he had nothing left to work with. And it was working. The weeks after our tense coffee shop meeting were some of the quietest I'd experienced since Emily's passing. David didn't call. He didn't show up at the main house or the lake house. At first, I wondered if he was regrouping, planning a new angle. But as time passed, I began to think he was simply retreating, licking his wounds, recalculating his options. Part of me expected that quiet to bring relief. Instead, it felt like the stillness before a storm. I'd lived too long to think a man like David would just walk away from something he believed was his by right. Then, one Tuesday morning, an envelope arrived at my P.O. box. It was from David. No letter, just a single piece of paper, an old photograph of us on a fishing trip when he was 12. On the back, he'd written, "We used to be close. I don't know what happened." I stared at the photo for a long time. That boy in the picture had been bright, eager, full of questions. Somewhere along the line, he'd turned into the man who had tried to sell the roof over my head while my wife's grave was still fresh. The distance between those two versions of him was a canyon neither of us could cross. I didn't write back. 2 weeks later, David called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short, almost clipped. "We need to talk about the will. I think you're making decisions you'll regret." That was it, the final spark I needed to close this chapter once and for all. The next day, I called my lawyer. We'd already established the trust for the lake house and outlined my main estate plan, but now I wanted it airtight. The main house would be sold upon my passing, with the proceeds split between the Veterans Assistance Fund and a scholarship program in Emily's name for local students. The lake house would remain in the trust used seasonally by the charity for retreats. Not a single cent would go to David. The lawyer asked if I was sure. I told him I was. 2 days later, I met David at a diner halfway between the lake and the main house. He walked in with his usual self-assured stride, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "I appreciate you coming," I said, gesturing to the seat across from me. "Let's not waste time," he replied, sitting down. "Why are you doing this? Cutting me out like I'm some kind of stranger?" I looked at him for a long moment, choosing my words carefully. Because trust isn't about blood, David. It's about actions. And your actions told me everything I needed to know. His hands clenched around his coffee cup. "You're punishing me for trying to help you move on. That house is too much for you." "That house," I interrupted, "was your mother's pride and joy. And you tried to sell it before the flowers on her grave had even wilted. You didn't come to help me move on David. You came to see what you could take." For a moment, I thought he might argue. But instead, he looked away, his eyes fixed on the window. I reached into my jacket and slid a sealed envelope across the table. "This is the updated estate plan. You're not in it. I wanted to tell you face to face so there'd be no surprises later." He didn't touch the envelope. "You really think cutting me out will make you feel better?" "It already has," I said simply. We sat there in silence for a while, the low hum of the diner filling the space between us. Eventually, he stood, leaving the envelope on the table. Without another word, he walked out. I stayed behind, sipping my coffee slowly. There was no sense of triumph, no burst of adrenaline, just a quiet, steady certainty that I'd done what needed to be done. Later that week, I stopped by the main house to check the mail and mow the lawn. Mrs. Landry waved from across the street. "Haven't seen your son around lately," she said with a small smile. "No," I replied, returning the smile. "I don't expect we'll be seeing much of each other anymore." When I returned to the lake house that evening, the sun was setting over the water, casting a warm orange glow across the ripples. I stood on the dock for a long time, breathing in the clean air, letting the quiet settle over me. The ties had been cut. Completely. There was no going back now, and I didn't want to. The days after that final meeting with David felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heavy weight had been quietly lifted off my shoulders. There was no dramatic burst of joy, no swelling orchestral score playing in my head, just a steady, enduring calm. I spent most of my time at the lake house now, only visiting the main house when absolutely necessary. The trust paperwork was finalized, the will was sealed, and my affairs were in order. Everything important was locked down, shielded from the kind of grasping hands that had been circling me for months. On quiet mornings, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the fog drift lazily across the water. The loons called in the distance, their mournful cries echoing off the tree-lined shore. It was the kind of sound that made you feel small and safe all at once. Emily used to say the lake had a voice, and I understood now what she meant. The garden I'd planted in early summer was starting to yield. Bright red tomatoes, crisp cucumbers, and a handful of peppers that Emily would have turned into her famous relish. I worked in the dirt with my bare hands, feeling connected to something simple and honest, things that couldn't be stolen or negotiated away. Occasionally, I'd think about David. I didn't dwell on him with anger anymore. He'd taken enough space in my head. Instead, I thought about the boy he'd been, the man he'd become, and how greed could twist the roots of even the closest family ties. I didn't regret my decision. If anything, I regretted not setting boundaries sooner. Word around town was that David had been keeping a low profile. The failed house deal had hurt his reputation more than he'd anticipated. People were polite to him in public, but there was a coolness there now, the kind that comes from quiet suspicion. In a small town, that kind of shadow follows you for a long time. One afternoon, as I was mending a section of fence near the waterline, a memory of Emily came to me so vividly, it felt like she was standing beside me. She was wearing her old blue scarf, the one that always seemed to slip from her shoulders, and she was laughing at something I'd said. In that moment, I felt an odd sort of gratitude, not for her absence, of course, but for the foresight she'd had in buying this place. She'd called it our escape hatch, and in the end, it had been exactly that. The lake house wasn't just shelter, it was proof that I could choose my own ending to this story, that I didn't have to let grief or manipulation dictate the rest of my life. In the evenings, I sometimes took my dinner out onto the dock. I'd sit with my feet dangling over the edge, the wooden boards warm from the day's sun, and watch as the light faded and the stars began to appear one by one. The air here cooled quickly after sunset, and the night carried a hush that felt almost sacred. Sometimes I'd speak to Emily in those moments, not out loud, just in the quiet of my thoughts. I'd tell her what I'd done, how I'd protected what we'd built, how I'd made sure her trust in me hadn't been misplaced. I'd like to think she'd approve not just of the outcome, but of the patience it had taken to get there. Every so often, a boat would pass, its small motor humming softly in the distance. I'd wave, and they'd wave back, strangers sharing a moment of acknowledgement before drifting apart again. That was enough for me. I didn't need the noise of the world pressing in anymore. The main house, with its creaking stairs and 2 big rooms, still stood where it always had. It would remain in my name until the day came for it to be sold according to my wishes, but it no longer held me. It was a structure now, nothing more, a place tied to a chapter I'd closed. The life I was living at the lake house felt like a truer reflection of who I'd become. I was no longer the man who'd sat numbly at his wife's funeral, vulnerable to the schemes of someone he'd once trusted without question. I was a man who'd learned that even in the face of betrayal, you could reclaim your life not with shouting or revenge in the heat of the moment, but with quiet, deliberate choices that left no openings for those who would take advantage. As summer began to give way to the first hints of autumn, the lake changed. The mornings grew crisper, the air smelling faintly of fallen leaves. I pulled out one of Emily's old quilts for the porch chair, wrapping it around my shoulders during the early hours. The quiet was still there, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Less about hiding, more about living. I'd won, though I didn't think of it in terms of victory anymore. It was more like balance had been restored. My boundaries were firm, my peace intact, my home safe. And in the end, that was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the water gold, I stood at the edge of the dock and let the breeze move through me. Somewhere out there, David was living with the choices he'd made. So was I. The difference was I'd made mine with my eyes open. And that's how it ended. The trust was set, the will was sealed, and my life, my peace was back in my hands. David, well, he made his choices, and now he has to live with them. As for me, I wake up each morning at the lake house with the sound of water against the dock, and I know Emily would be proud, not because I won, but because I protected what we built together. If my story means anything to you, it's this: you're never too old, too tired, or too broken to take back control of your life. And if you want to hear more true raw stories like mine, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and join me for the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon.